I ask unanimous consent that my 10 minutes be extended to 15 minutes.
Without objection.
Mr. President, we're introducing today a CRA, and it's kind of interesting. This is something that has only been successful one time. But I think that everyone knows that during the past 8 years, the Obama administration, we've seen thousands, literally thousands of regulations that have come through that have been anti-business, many of them anti-certain businesses, such as the oil and gas industry. There's no secret to the fact that we have had a president in President Obama who has had a war on fossil fuels. And that's something that it's kind of interesting to me when I go back to my state of Oklahoma. And one reason I go back all the time is because I want to be around real rational people. And sometimes I get to the feeling that there really aren't any around here. They ask you a question. They'll say, tell me, explain this to me. If we have here in the United States of America, in order to generate power, 89% of the power that we're generating is either fossil fuels, that's coal, oil, or gas, or it's nuclear. Now, if you do away with that, and you do away with 89% of our generation capability, then how do you run the machine called America? And the answer is you can't. But you don't get that question here. And I'm sure that that most of us that go back is not just confined to Oklahoma with people with that kind of a concern. Now, I chaired the Environment and Public Works Committee during the 8 years, during the time that President Obama was in, and most of the regulations actually were associated with that committee. Many of the committees out there had regulations associated with those committees, but not near as many as the Environment and Public Works. To give you an example, the WOTUS. If you ask anyone with the American Farm Bureau or anyone who deals with farmers and ranchers, the number one problem that they have, they'll tell you, it's nothing that's found on the Ag Bill. It is the overregulation of the EPA. It just is an example. And of course, that's the Environment and Public Works Committee is the committee that has the jurisdiction over the EPA, at least we're supposed to. And during that time, that when the WOTUS came through, that was the water regulation. It has historically always been the state's jurisdiction to handle the water issues and not the federal government, with the exception of navigable water, and I think we all understand that. In fact, there have been several liberal members of the House and the Senate that have tried to pass legislation that take that word navigable out, and every time we have defeated them. In fact, the last two that tried to do that, they were defeated at the polls. So this is something that really is significant. We know in our state of Oklahoma, I shouldn't say we know, our farmers know, that if you put them in charge of the water regulation, in the western part of Oklahoma, which is a arid part of the state, it would end up being wetlands by the time the federal government. Anyway, that's a major concern that they had. Another one, the Clean Power Plan. The Clean Power Plan was the power plan of President Obama. We all know how that came about. We know that way back in 1972, I was one of the bad guys that told the truth about what they're referring to, global warming, the world was coming to an end. And so even though a lot of the members of this body didn't join in and agree with me, every time, without exception, that they came up with a bill that would do something, we have a cap and trade bill, for example, we defeated the bill. And it defeated by a larger margin as the time went by. When President Obama came in, he did with that, as he did with a lot of issues, if you can't pass something and kill something or get something passed through legislation, then you try to do it through regulation. Well, that's what he did. They called it the Clean Power Plan. It's the same thing that's been rejected. And of course, that's another rule. I only bring out those because those are typical over-regulations to put people out of business that actually came through my committee. However, I'm here to introduce this morning Senate Joint Resolution 9, and this is something that did not come through my committee. This came through, this was the a provision that is in the Dodd-Frank bill. Now, anyone going back to your states and you're talking to bankers or anyone in the financial industry, and talk about the Dodd-Frank bill, that's overregulation. The same as overregulation takes place on many of the issues that came before my committee. Well, this thing has a section in it, the Dodd-Frank bill, section 1504. Section 1504 of the bill requires the SEC, that's the Securities and Exchange Commission, to develop a rule, requires them to develop a rule that requires companies to report payments made to a foreign government or to the U.S. federal government relating to the commercial development of oil, natural gas, and minerals. Now, that's a requirement. That's saying that and that is not found in our committee. That was found in the committee that handled the Dodd-Frank bill. And while that may not sound all that significant, it strikes at the heart of American competitiveness. It makes the public our best companies, the information of our very best companies on how to win oil and gas deals. So it requires companies to disclose and make public highly confidential and commercially sensitive information, and this is information that foreign competitors don't have. Now, they're not required to have it, but under this regulation, we would be required to have it. Now, that means that we would have to disclose all of the background, all of the information that a company had on how they are competing to compete for some kind of an oil gas thing. It could be with another country like Iran. It could be with individuals over there that are not friendly to the United States. Now, countries that don't wish to disclose the details of their commercial deals would now have a strong incentive to go with companies in countries that don't have that burdensome requirement. That's only natural. And that, to make matters worse, the SEC's rule lacks an exemption for circumstances in which disclosure under Section 1504 would violate the laws of a country where the United States company is operating. So it leaves the United States companies with the choice of complying with the U.S. laws or the foreign laws at other countries. And that's an impossible position to put our companies in. Now, if that weren't enough, the cost of complying with this regulation is enormous. Keep in mind, the ones who are going to have to comply are American companies here in this country that their competition doesn't have to pay. And we're talking about millions of dollars. In fact, the SEC came up with an estimate that the total compliance cost initially, this is the initial cost, would be up to $700 million. And then afterwards, the ongoing compliance cost would be as much as $581 million annually. Again, those are our companies, and our competition would not have to do that. Now, the courts have already struck this rule down when it was first developed in August of 2012. The D.C. Federal District Court struck down the rule in 2013 because of two substantial errors. Specifically, the commission had misread Section 1504 to mandate public disclosure of the reports and had arbitrarily declined to provide an exemption for countries that prohibit disclosure. The new rule, finalized in June of 2016, doesn't look any different. It's the same thing. Even though the SEC was told by the courts that the rule did not affect congressional intent, they continued to put out a new rule that had the exact same problems as the one the court had vacated. It's the same rule. It's as if the Obama administration was rushing this rule out in hopes that they wouldn't have time or the opportunity for a court or Congress to overturn it. But here we are in the process of overturning it. Last week, President Trump issued an executive order to reduce the regulatory impact on American businesses. With this CRA, we have an opportunity to effectively participate in that. Our focus should always be American first. And as the Congress always look to protect the competitiveness of the American companies, they should not be subjecting their own citizens to lawsuits. And that's exactly what this would do. And by the way, I think we're going to get a lot of CRA efforts coming forth. And I think it's important for people to understand what that is. The CRA is a Congressional Review Act. A CRA, there are a lot of people, liberal people like to have the power concentrated in Washington. like the WOTUS rule, the water rule. They would rather have under the jurisdiction of the federal government instead of the state governments. That's human nature. That's something that is not up for debate. Everybody knows that. And so what we have tried to do, and what individuals who are trying to centralize power in Washington, they'll go home, and when they hear the complaints of all the people that are out in their states complaining about the regulations, the over-regulations of our society, their response is, well, that's not us. That's some unelected bureaucrat. Well, what a CRA does is force the members of the Senate and the members of the House of Representatives, those who are accountable to the people, to take a position, so that they can't go home and say, no, this is just the regulators doing it. Well, that's kind of interesting because it puts them in a position where we pass a CRA, which we're going to pass on this CRA, which is Joint Resolution number 9. Then this will come before this body, and people will have to say yes or no, should we do away with this rule that everyone back home is opposed to? And so it forces them to be honest. So I think this is one of the CRAs that many Democrats should be sponsoring and voting for, and I wouldn't be surprised if we should be able to get some. So just one last thing here to outline what this is about. There's one section in the Dodd-Frank bill, one section called 1504. In this section, they put a requirement on companies that are competing for oil and gas deals throughout the world, that they're going to have to tell their competition what goes into their bid, how they're putting this thing together, and the other side doesn't have to do that. That's what it's all about, and that's what it is. And so I do look forward to the opportunity to bring this in as soon as we get our initial 30 on here. You'll see this and have an opportunity to support this first CRA that I'm very excited about. Mr. President, I yield the floor.